Hello, it's Psychocore. We present borderline personality and intimate attachment, Jungian shadow work in sexual trauma. The intricate dance between borderline personality disorder and intimate relationships reveals itself as one of the most complex psychological phenomena in contemporary clinical practice. When we examine the intersection of attachment theory, sexual trauma, and Jungian analytical psychology, we encounter a labyrinth of unconscious patterns that govern human intimacy with devastating precision. Borderline personality disorder manifests as a profound disturbance in the capacity to maintain stable relationships, particularly those of an intimate nature. The individual with BPD exists in a perpetual state of psychological dysregulation, where the fear of abandonment creates paradoxical behaviors that ultimately drive away the very connections they desperately seek. This fundamental contradiction lies at the heart of their sexual and romantic experiences, transforming intimacy into a battlefield of projections, defenses, and unconscious reenactments. The concept of attachment, as originally formulated by John Bowlby and later expanded by Mary Ainsworth, provides crucial insight into how early relational experiences shape adult intimate patterns. However, when viewed through the lens of Jungian psychology, these attachment styles reveal themselves as expressions of deeper archetypal dynamics operating within the collective unconscious. The borderline individual's disorganized attachment pattern represents not merely a developmental failure, but a profound encounter with what Jung termed the shadow. Those aspects of the psyche that remain hidden, denied, and projected onto others. In the realm of sexual intimacy, the borderline personality structure creates a unique constellation of psychological defenses that serve both protective and destructive functions. The phenomenon of splitting, the tendency to perceive others as either entirely good or entirely bad, manifests in sexual relationships as alternating idealization and devaluation of partners. This primitive defense mechanism, while protecting the individual from the anxiety of ambiguity, simultaneously prevents the integration of a coherent sense of self and other necessary for mature, intimate connection. The sexual behavior of individuals with borderline personality disorder often reflects underlying trauma patterns that have become encoded in the body's memory systems. Sexual trauma, whether occurring in childhood or adulthood, creates dissociative responses that fragment the integration of mind, body, and emotion during intimate encounters. These dissociative episodes serve as protective mechanisms, allowing the individual to psychologically escape threatening situations while maintaining physical presence. Jung's concept of the shadow becomes particularly relevant when examining how sexual trauma manifests in borderline relationships. The shadow contains not only the individual's personal repressed material, but also collective human experiences of violence, betrayal, and abandonment that have been passed down through generations. For the borderline individual, intimate relationships become theaters where these shadow projections are enacted, often resulting in repetitive cycles of trauma reenactment. The psychological defense of projective identification plays a crucial role in how borderline individuals navigate intimate relationships. This mechanism involves unconsciously projecting unwanted aspects of the self onto the partner, then attempting to control or change the partner in order to manage these projected elements. In sexual relationships, this often manifests as attempts to control the partner's sexuality, jealousy, possessiveness, or conversely as promiscuous behavior designed to maintain emotional distance while seeking validation. The phenomenon of dissociation during sexual encounters represents a complex adaptation to trauma that serves multiple psychological functions. While dissociation provides temporary relief from overwhelming emotions and sensations, it also prevents the integration of sexual experience into a coherent sense of self. This fragmentation creates a cycle where intimacy becomes increasingly threatening, as it activates both the desire for connection and the fear of annihilation that characterizes the borderline experience. From a Jungian perspective, the work of healing sexual trauma within the context of borderline personality disorder requires a fundamental engagement with the shadow. This process involves recognizing and integrating the split-off aspects of the psyche that have been projected onto others or dissociated from consciousness. The therapeutic relationship becomes a container for this integration process, allowing the individual to gradually reclaim ownership of their projections and develop a more cohesive sense of self. The concept of individuation, central to Jungian psychology, takes on particular significance in the treatment of borderline individuals who have experienced sexual trauma. Individuation involves the gradual integration of conscious and unconscious elements of the psyche, leading to a more authentic and complete sense of self. For the borderline individual, this process requires confronting not only personal trauma but also the archetypal patterns that have been activated by their experiences. Sexual intimacy, when approached through the lens of shadow work, becomes an opportunity for profound psychological healing rather than merely a source of trauma reenactment. This transformation requires developing the capacity to remain present during intimate encounters, tolerating the anxiety and vulnerability that intimacy naturally evokes while maintaining connection to both self and partner. The therapeutic process of working with sexual trauma in borderline personality disorder involves several key elements. First, the development of affect regulation skills allows the individual to tolerate the intense emotions that arise during intimate moments without resorting to dissociation or other maladaptive defenses. Second, the exploration of attachment patterns helps identify how early relational experiences continue to influence adult intimate relationships. Third, the integration of shadow material allows for the reclamation of projected aspects of the self that have been disowned or denied. The body plays a crucial role in this healing process, as sexual trauma is stored not only in psychological memory but also in somatic experience. Approaches that integrate body awareness with psychological insight, such as somatic experiencing or sensoromotor psychotherapy, can be particularly effective in helping borderline individuals develop a more integrated relationship with their sexuality. The phenomenon of sexual addiction often co-occurs with borderline personality disorder, representing another manifestation of the underlying attachment disruption and trauma history. Sexual addiction serves as both a means of seeking connection and avoiding true intimacy, creating a paradoxical situation where the individual engages in sexual behavior while remaining emotionally disconnected from the experience. The process of healing involves developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in tension without being overwhelmed by the conflict. For the borderline individual, this means learning to tolerate the simultaneous presence of love and hate, desire and fear, connection and autonomy that characterizes mature, intimate relationships. The role of the therapeutic relationship in this healing process cannot be overstated. The therapist must provide a consistent, boundaried presence that can contain the individual's projections and splitting, while maintaining their own psychological stability. This relationship becomes a laboratory for exploring attachment patterns and practicing new ways of relating that can then be transferred to intimate partnerships. The integration of sexual trauma through shadow work requires facing the parts of the self that have been deemed unacceptable or dangerous. This often includes rage, neediness, sexuality, aggression, and vulnerability, all aspects of human experience that may have been punished or exploited in the individual's history. The therapeutic process involves gradually reclaiming these aspects as legitimate parts of the self, rather than dangerous forces that must be projected onto others. The concept of the anima and animus, Jung's terms for the feminine and masculine aspects of the psyche, becomes particularly relevant in understanding how borderline individuals experience intimate relationships. The failure to integrate these archetypal energies can result in seeking completion through fusion with another person, rather than developing an internal sense of wholeness. The healing of sexual trauma within the context of borderline personality disorder ultimately involves a fundamental transformation of the individual's relationship to their own sexuality. This transformation requires moving from a position of victimization to one of agency, from fragmentation to integration, from projection to ownership. The process is neither linear nor predictable, but when successful, it results in the capacity for genuine intimacy that honors both connection and autonomy. The implications of this work extend beyond individual healing to broader questions about the nature of human sexuality and intimate relationships. In a culture that often pathologizes intense emotional expression while simultaneously exploiting sexuality, the borderline individual's struggle reveals important truths about the human need for authentic connection and the devastating consequences of its absence. The integration of Jungian shadow work with trauma-informed approaches to borderline personality disorder offers a comprehensive framework for understanding and treating these complex presentations. By addressing both the personal and archetypal dimensions of sexual trauma, this approach provides a path toward healing that honors the full complexity of human psychological experience. The neurobiological foundations of borderline personality disorder provide additional insight into the complex relationship between trauma, attachment, and sexuality. Research in neuroscience has revealed that individuals with BPD demonstrate altered activity in brain regions associated with emotional regulation, impulse control, and threat detection. The amygdala, which processes fear and threat, shows hyperactivity in borderline individuals, while the prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive functioning and emotional regulation, demonstrates reduced activity. This neurobiological dysregulation directly impacts sexual experiences, as the heightened threat response system interprets intimate vulnerability as danger, triggering fight or flight responses during moments intended for connection. The phenomenon of emotional dysregulation in borderline personality disorder creates a unique constellation of challenges within intimate relationships. The individual's emotional responses to sexual encounters often appear disproportionate to the situation, reflecting the activation of implicit trauma memories rather than present-moment reality. This temporal collapse, where past and present merge, transforms the bedroom into a battlefield where historical wounds are unconsciously reenacted with current partners. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious becomes particularly relevant when examining how sexual trauma patterns repeat across generations. The archetypal energies of the wounded feminine and toxic masculine manifest in borderline relationships as compulsive repetition of familiar yet destructive dynamics. The individual unconsciously seeks partners who will recreate the original trauma scenario, not out of masochism, but from an unconscious attempt to master the original wound through repetition. The defense mechanism of denial operates powerfully within the sexual sphere for borderline individuals. The conscious mind's refusal to acknowledge the full extent of trauma history creates a fragmented narrative where sexual experiences are compartmentalized and disconnected from emotional reality. This denial serves the protective function of maintaining psychological survival, yet simultaneously prevents the integration necessary for healthy sexual expression. Projective identification in sexual relationships manifests as a complex psychological dance, where the borderline individual unconsciously induces feelings in their partner that mirror their own disowned emotional states. If the individual cannot tolerate their own feelings of rage, shame, or abandonment, they may unconsciously behave in ways that provoke these emotions in their partner, then attempt to control or heal these feelings through managing the partner's responses. The concept of sexual compulsivity in borderline personality disorder represents an attempt to regulate overwhelming internal states through external means. Sexual behavior becomes a form of self-medication, providing temporary relief from feelings of emptiness, abandonment, or emotional dysregulation. However, this pattern ultimately reinforces the cycle of shame and self-destruction that characterizes the disorder. The therapeutic process of working with sexual trauma in borderline individuals requires careful attention to the phenomenon of transference and countertransference. The intensity of the borderline individual's emotional states can provoke strong reactions in therapists who may find themselves feeling overwhelmed, angry, or protective. These reactions, when properly understood and processed, provide valuable information about the individual's internal world and relational patterns. The integration of somatic approaches with traditional talk therapy becomes essential when addressing sexual trauma and borderline personality disorder. The body holds memories and patterns that cannot be accessed through cognitive means alone. Techniques such as breathwork, movement therapy, and sensory awareness help individuals develop a more integrated relationship with their physical experience, allowing for the gradual reclamation of bodily autonomy and pleasure. The phenomenon of sexual dissociation creates a particular challenge in therapeutic work, as the individual may be present in body but absent in consciousness during intimate encounters. This splitting of awareness serves as protection against overwhelming sensation and emotion, yet also prevents the integration of sexual experience into a coherent sense of self. The therapeutic work involves gradually developing tolerance for increased embodied presence during intimate moments. The archetypal dimension of sexual healing in borderline personality disorder involves engaging with fundamental human experiences of power, surrender, vulnerability, and ecstasy. These archetypal energies, when unconscious and unintegrated, can manifest as destructive patterns of sexual behavior. However, when brought into conscious awareness through therapeutic work, they become sources of profound healing and transformation. The concept of the wounded healer, central to Jungian psychology, takes on particular significance in the treatment of sexual trauma within borderline personality disorder. The individual's capacity to heal their own wounds becomes directly related to their ability to hold space for their partner's vulnerability and wounds. This mutual healing process requires the development of what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites in creative tension. The role of shame in sexual trauma cannot be underestimated, as it serves as both a protective mechanism and a source of continued suffering. Shame about sexual desires, experiences, or responses creates a cycle of self-punishment that reinforces the original trauma. The therapeutic work involves gradually developing self-compassion and acceptance of the full range of human sexual experience. The phenomenon of sexual reenactment in borderline relationships often involves unconscious attempts to transform passive trauma into active mastery. The individual may repeatedly place themselves in situations that mirror the original trauma, unconsciously believing they can change the outcome through repetition. This pattern requires careful therapeutic attention to help the individual recognize these dynamics and develop healthier ways of processing traumatic material. The integration of couples therapy with individual work becomes crucial when addressing sexual trauma and borderline personality disorder. The partner's understanding and support can provide crucial containment for the healing process, while their own reactions and patterns may require attention to prevent perpetuation of dysfunctional dynamics. The concept of sexual boundaries takes on particular complexity in borderline personality disorder, as the individual's difficulty with identity and interpersonal boundaries extends into the sexual realm. The development of healthy sexual boundaries requires first developing a clear sense of self, which is often compromised in borderline pathology. This process involves learning to distinguish between self and other, desire and compulsion, love and addiction. The phenomenon of sexual trauma bonding creates particularly complex dynamics in borderline relationships, where intensity is often confused with intimacy. The individual may unconsciously seek relationships that recreate the familiar patterns of trauma and rescue, mistaking the chemical high of crisis for genuine connection. Breaking these patterns requires developing tolerance for the anxiety and boredom that may accompany healthy, stable relationships. The therapeutic relationship provides a unique opportunity to explore these dynamics in a safe, boundaried context. The therapist's consistent presence and emotional availability can serve as a corrective emotional experience, demonstrating that intimacy need not result in abandonment or violation. This relationship becomes a laboratory for practicing new ways of relating that can then be transferred to romantic partnerships. The process of sexual healing in borderline personality disorder ultimately requires a fundamental transformation of the individual's relationship to power, vulnerability, and intimacy. This transformation involves moving from positions of victim and perpetrator to one of conscious choice and mutual respect. The journey is neither linear nor predictable, requiring patience, compassion, and unwavering commitment to the process of integration and healing. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share the video.